The Myth of the Aboriginal Farmer, a comprehensive refutation of dark emu. In the early decades of the 21st century, the Australian cultural landscape experienced a profound historiographical shock that transformed the national conversation. The publication of Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe did not merely generate a localized academic debate or ripple through university corridors. It ignited a sweeping socio-political transformation across educational, governmental, and media institutions. The book's central thesis was startlingly clear and intentionally provocative. It asserted that the established narrative of pre-colonial Aboriginal Australians as nomadic hunter-gatherers was an elaborate, Eurocentric, colonial lie. This lie, Pascoe argued, had been deliberately constructed, maintained, and institutionalized by generations of British administrators, pioneering pastoral settlers, and subsequent academic historians to justify the violent dispossession of the Australian continent under the legal convenience of terra nullius land belonging to no one. According to the Dark Emu paradigm, pre-colonial Australia was actually an agrarian landscape characterized by vast fields of systematically tilled, sown, and harvested native monocultures. It claimed that the continent was defined by large, sedentary towns comprised of permanent, stone-walled houses that sheltered thousands of citizens year-round. Complex, continental-scale irrigation works and monumental aquaculture networks, and massive, fixed grain storage structures to manage multi-seasonal food surpluses. This model sought to append the foundational assumptions of Australian prehistory by replacing a dynamic, mobile lifeway with a carbon copy of Western agrarianism, presenting a landscape of managed fields and architectural permanence that mirrored the agricultural revolutions of the Northern Hemisphere. The emotional, psychological, and institutional reception of this thesis was immediate, passionate, and uncritical. Within a remarkably brief period, the book achieved unprecedented mainstream success across the country. It was elevated to a perennial bestseller, received prestigious literary accolades from major cultural institutions, was adapted into simplified versions for children, and was rapidly integrated into national primary and secondary school curricula as a factual historical source text. For a nation entangled in painful historical reconciliation, Dark Emu offered an incredibly comforting moral solution. It suggested that pre-colonial Australia mirrored the developmental trajectory of traditional European and Asian civilizations. By doing so, it implied that the true tragedy of colonization was not the disruption of a unique, highly successful hunter-gatherer lifeway, but rather the destruction of a parallel agricultural civilization that modern Australians could easily recognize, validate, and judge by Western standards of progress. The rapid institutionalization of Dark Emu represents a profound case study in the vulnerability of academic systems to popular political movements. For several years, the book enjoyed virtual immunity from rigorous public critique. Within the university sector's media organizations and educational departments, an environment rapidly developed where questioning Pascoe's conclusions was frequently treated as an act of political regression. a denial of indigenous achievement, or an attempt to defend colonial racism. This toxic environment created a dangerous, prolonged silence. Professional archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, many of whom knew immediately that the book's claims ran completely counter to decades of peer-reviewed fieldwork, stratigraphic excavations, and archival analysis withheld their public criticisms. They feared institutional marginalization, public denunciation, or the loss of research funding if they went against the prevailing consensus. Consequently, a work written by a literary figure with no formal training in archaeology or historical methodology bypassed scientific peer review. It was accepted as an authoritative, unassailable historical text by government departments, curriculum developers, and major cultural bodies based purely on its narrative appeal and political utility rather than its empirical validity. This institutional captivity allowed a profoundly flawed historical narrative to become normalized as historical truth within schools. It created a situation where a generation of students was taught a fictionalized version of prehistory, setting the stage for a major, inevitable collision between popular myth-making and strict scientific reality. To dismantle a historical thesis of this magnitude requires more than counter-assertions or rhetorical complaints. It demands an absolute adherence to rigorous historical methods. The standard of proof in historical science relies upon a multi-tiered framework of verification that leaves no room for creative interpretation or loose speculation. Primary documentary sources, original texts, must be cross-examined in their complete, unedited context to ensure linguistic and observational integrity, checking for selective deletions. The material record. Physical artifacts and architectural footprints in the earth must be quantitatively analyzed to test hypotheses regarding population, density, storage, and sedentism. Bioarchaeological assessment. Biological remains of human actors must be assessed to read the physiological signature of their actual daily sustenance. Health and mobility patterns. Ecological and soil science. Findings must be evaluated against the hard laws of soil nutrients, climate, volatility, and geological realities of the Australian continent. When dark emu is subjected to this fourfold grid of empirical analysis, it does not merely reveal minor errors or eccentric interpretations. It exhibits systemic collapse. The text operates by consistently substituting rhetorical enthusiasm for forensic analysis, inventing categories of land use explicitly refuted by the very documents cited, by analyzing the structural reality of pre-colonial Australian lifeways. Genuine scholarship does not minimize the sophisticated relationship between indigenous populations and the continent. Rather, it rescues that relationship from an artificial, Eurocentric framework that judges civilizational value solely by a culture's capacity to extract wealth via landscape modification. The ready acceptance of the agricultural model by the Australian public highlights a critical shift in how modern society consumes historical knowledge today. In a digital environment prioritizing emotional resonance and simple narratives over rigorous verification, long-form academic research faces severe structural disadvantages. Peer-reviewed journal articles, written with cautious qualifiers and stuffed with specialized statistical tables. Rarely break through to mainstream awareness or influence public opinion. Dark Emu filled this gap by presenting a clean, accessible binary narrative that resolved complex social and historical issues by correcting a single error. The public eagerly embraced the text because it allowed them to engage with Indigenous history through a familiar Western lens, production, and infrastructure. It did not require them to understand the radical differences of a non-extractive, highly mobile hunter-gatherer ontology that valued conservation over accumulation. Instead, it presented history as something instantly recognizable: towns, fields, fences, and grain stores, providing immediate psychological satisfaction to a culture seeking redemption. The core methodology of Dark Emu relies on a direct appeal to the journals of early European explorers, surveyors, and colonial administrators. Pascoe claims that early British explorers accurately recorded sedentary Aboriginal agriculture, but that these descriptions were later suppressed by colonial authorities to hide the truth. The primary historical figure utilized to support this argument is the brilliant 19th century explorer Rails Sir Thomas Mitchell. Pascoe quotes Mitchell extensively to conjure vivid imagery of endless fields of native millet, carefully tilled soils, and vast networks of permanent huts. However, when we conduct a rigorous, line-by-line examination of Mitchell's complete, unedited journals from 1838, the revisionist argument completely unravels. Pascoe's methodology relies on selective citation, semantic manipulation, and the deliberate omission of sentences that immediately follow his chosen quotes. In one passage, Pascoe quotes Mitchell describing a vast area of native grass that had been harvested, leaving haycocks stretching across the landscape. Dark Emu presents this as definitive proof of broadacre, European-style crop cultivation. But Pascoe hides Mitchell's observation that these grasses were entirely wild. Mitchell notes with absolute clarity that the local Aboriginal people did not clear the land, did not till the soil, and did not store seed. They were practicing an intelligent, opportunistic form of hunter-gatherer harvesting, gathering a seasonal abundance provided entirely by the natural rhythms of the climate. By stripping away Mitchell's explicit descriptions of wild resource exploitation, Dark Emu turns an advanced hunter-gatherer society into a collection of fictional farmers. A similar pattern of systematic, textual distortion occurs in Dark Emu's treatment of Captain Charles Sturt's expeditions into the arid interior of Central Australia between 1844 and 1846. Pascoe utilizes Sturt's encounter with an Aboriginal settlement to argue that Sturt discovered a permanent town supported by a structured agricultural economy. Dark Emu claims this settlement featured hundreds of people in engineered dwellings, supported by grain storage depots and an overarching civic assembly hall. When we consult Sturt's original text, narrative of an expedition into Central Australia, we discover that Pascoe has completely ignored the extreme environmental context that Sturt was explicitly documenting. Sturt did not stumble upon a permanent, thriving agricultural city. He arrived at a critical, temporary refuge point during a period of catastrophic regional drought. The hundreds of people Sturt encountered had not lived in that single location for generations as a settled farming community. They had been forced to aggregate around one of the very few surviving permanent waterholes in the entire geographic zone. The small piles of native grass seed Sturt observed were not agricultural surpluses held in permanent silos. They were emergency rations gathered opportunistically from the drying country to survive an immediate, life-threatening environmental crisis as soon as the rains broke and the desert pools refilled. This large can be small, highly mobile hunting bands. Furthermore, Sturt's journals record that as soon as the rains broke and the surrounding desert pools refilled, this large gathering immediately dispersed back into small, highly mobile, kin-based hunting bands. The town vanished overnight because its existence was a temporary, nomadic adaptation to extreme weather, not a settled agricultural commune. The textual manipulation practiced within Dark Emu relies fundamentally on a process of semantic translation, wherein standard descriptive terms utilized by 19th century observers are wrenched from their historical context and inflated into 21st century urbanist vocabulary. When an explorer utilizes the word village or town, an empirical historian must ascertain the precise linguistic baseline of that observer. In 19th century travel literature, village was frequently applied to any localized cluster of human dwellings exceeding 3 or 4 units, completely independent of whether those dwellings were occupied permanently, seasonally, or temporarily. Pascoe capitalizes on this fluid terminology by translating every instance of the word village as literal, permanent, year-round sedentary urbanization. If an explorer notes that an Aboriginal camp contained 20 huts, Dark Emu records this as a permanent town. However, the same entries reveal that observers almost universally noted the empty, abandoned nature of these camps during subsequent visits. The structures were architectural adaptations designed to be reoccupied during specific seasonal cycles or resource gluts, serving as fixed spatial hubs within a fundamentally fluid, non-sedentary geographic orbit. By masking this structural mobility under the vocabulary of modern municipal permanence, Dark Emu constructs a completely deceptive cartography of pre-colonial settlement patterns. Further, inspection of Pascoe's archival work reveals major omissions regarding Mitchell's interactions with the interior river networks. In passages where Mitchell details the construction of large, robust huts along the Darling River, Dark Emu pauses the quotation before Mitchell explains their functional seasonal purpose. Mitchell recorded that heavy, clay-lined structures were built strictly as specialized winter shelters to shield people from freezing southerly winds. During spring and summer, the same populations completely abandon these heavy huts, shifting to light, open-sided bark shelters along shifting gravel bars. By omitting notes on seasonal movement, Dark Emu creates an impression of permanent residency where there was actually a dynamic pattern of adaptation. The architectural variation was not evidence of early urban steps. It was a sophisticated toolkit used by a mobile population to thrive across changing seasonal conditions without disrupting the ecosystem. To provide physical, material weight to his thesis of a sedentary, built environment, Pascoe relies heavily on the spectacular archaeological landscapes of Budge, Bimlake Kunda in western Victoria. Dark Emu describes Budgebim as a monumental stone-walled city, a sprawling urban centre where permanent stone houses were built alongside massive artificial canals, representing a settled society that had abandoned nomadic hunting and gathering in favour of permanent aquaculture engineering. This depiction runs completely counter to decades of intensive, peer-reviewed archaeological fieldwork conducted at the site by professional archaeologists working in close collaboration with the Gunditjmara traditional owners. Quantitative, spatial mapping, and radiocarbon dating show that the stone structures at Budgebim were never permanent, year-round urban houses. Instead, they were low, circular stone arrangements that functioned as sturdy footings or windbreaks designed to support temporary wooden and bark superstructures. The archaeological data reveals that Budgebim was an intensely managed, highly specialized seasonal harvesting node. The intricate systems of stone channels, traps, and weirs were designed to manipulate and intercept the movements of migrating, short-finned eels. Aboriginal groups did not live at these traps every day of the year. They occupied the site during specific seasonal migrations. Once the eel harvests were complete and processed via sophisticated smoking techniques, these groups packed up their gear and moved to other locations across the volcanic plains to exploit different seasonal resources, such as root vegetables, waterfowl, and macropods. Budgebim represents a magnificent peak of hunter-gatherer environmental engineering, but calling it a sedentary town misinterprets how the site was actually used. In the study of global archaeology, the transition from hunting and gathering to true agriculture is always accompanied by a permanent, highly visible transformation in the material toolkit of a society. Because farming requires the mechanical alteration of landscapes and the processing of tough domestic grains, the archaeological layers of early agricultural societies are filled with specific, durable artifacts, deep-cutting hoes, mattocks, and ardplows designed to turn over topsoil and clear root networks. Heavy stone axes, adzes, and mattocks designed for large-scale land clearing and forest removal. Flint, obsidian, or groundstone sickles designed for the rapid, efficient harvesting of dense crop rows. Massive, permanent stone querns and mortar engineered for the intensive grinding of domestic grains. When we survey the entire pre-colonial archaeological record of the Australian continent, spanning more than 60,000 years across thousands of excavated sites, this agricultural toolkit is completely missing. The primary harvesting tool used by Aboriginal women across the continent was the simple, highly elegant wooden digging stick. While it loosened surface soils, it was incapable of performing deep mechanical tillage. The stone tools found are scrapers and portable grinding stones. The complete absence of specialized agricultural machinery is absolute physical proof that pre-colonial populations never developed an industrial farming economy. The definitive arbiters of archaeological intent are stratigraphy and spatial distribution. In any landscape defined by sedentary agriculture, the earth retains structural signatures of long-term soil manipulation, field boundaries, leveling operations, and localized refuse accumulation. Excavations across Europe, Asia, and Mesoamerica regularly reveal ancient field systems demarcated by ditches, lynchets, and chemical alterations in soil nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations resulting from continuous fertilization and crop extraction. In Nostra, archaeological surveys have consistently failed to detect any such signatures of field engineering, furrow networks, or systematic soil clearance. The archaeological layers show a continuous pattern of hunter-gatherer land use, hearth pits containing the bones of wild fauna, scatters of knapped stone tools, and charcoal lenses indicative of broadacre, mosaic, burning. The spatial organization of sites reveals a pattern designed to avoid fixing human populations to a singular geographic point. Sites are characterized by brief, high-intensity occupation, events followed by extended periods of structural absence, allowing environments to recover naturally. When archaeologists reduce their scale of observation to micro-artifacts, the tiny debris particles smaller than 2 millimeters left behind during human occupation the actual functionality of pre-colonial sites becomes transparent. If sites like the stone arrangements in Western Victoria were permanent urban hubs, the micro-refuse profiles would exhibit high concentrations of domestic waste, deep accumulations of broken operational tools, and thick deposits of food preparation residue. However, multi-site micro-refuse profiling across these volcanic plains presents a vastly different signature. The microdebris consists almost exclusively of low-density, stone-flaking chips and highly localized, thin charcoal deposits. This profile indicates a pattern of repetitive, short-term use. Small groups arrived, processed resource surges, maintained their tools, and departed. The microarchaeological record shows that these sites were used for high-intensity, short-term harvesting, directly contradicting the narrative of permanent town living. The scientific definition of agriculture requires a permanent change in the relationship between humans and plants, resulting in the genetic and morphological transformation of wild species into fully domesticated crops. Through thousands of years of selective breeding and cultivation, human farmers change the physical structure of plants, enlarging seed heads, weakening natural seed dispersal mechanisms, and removing natural toxins to ensure reliable production. In dark emu, Pascoe asserts that species like the yam, daisy, and native grasses were fully domesticated crops subjected to systematic cultivation. However, modern botanical science and genetic mapping completely disprove this assertion. Studies of native Australian grasses show absolutely no difference between pre-colonial specimens and their wild, uncultivated relatives. The seeds harvested by Aboriginal communities retained their fragile rachis de teint, the plant which is the hallmark of a wild grass designed to naturally shatter and scatter its seeds into the wind. Had these plants been subjected to generations of agricultural sowing and selection, as Pascoe claims, they would have developed the tough, rachis characteristic of domesticated grains like wheat or rice, rendering them dependent on human intervention for reproduction. The unchanged genetic profile of Australian flora is undeniable proof these plants were harvested as wild resources, not bred as crops. If the thesis of dark emu were correct, and millions of Aboriginal Australians had abandoned a mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle to live in dense, sedentary agricultural towns, this massive change would be permanently written into the bones of the ancestors themselves. In every region of the world, where humans transitioned to an agricultural lifestyle, the human skeletal record experiences a dramatic, highly predictable drop in overall health and life expectancy. This agricultural penalty is characterized by specific, unmistakable skeletal markers, linear enamel hypoplasia distinct horizontal lines across teeth indicating severe growth arrests caused by childhood, malnutrition, and seasonal crop failures. Porotiki perosto e cribra orbitalis pandlagogni, which spikes when populations rely on a monotonous grain carbohydrate diet. Dental caries, extensive tooth decay, and abscesses caused by the constant consumption of sticky, processed agricultural carbohydrates. Chronic bone infections like periostitis also appear, caused by waterborne pathogens and waste accumulation in permanent, high-density villages. When Australian bioarchaeologists and physical anthropologists examine thousands of pre-colonial Aboriginal skeletal remains from diverse environments across the continent, they find the exact opposite profile. Pre-colonial populations possessed exceptional health, showing long, robust limbs, dense cortical bone, and remarkably low rates of dental decay. There is an almost complete absence of the chronic, infectious lesions that define early sedentary farming communities. This biological profile proves a nutrient-dense diet, rich in wild proteins and diverse plants, maintained by a mobile lifestyle. This lifestyle naturally prevented the spread of village-borne diseases that ravaged sedentary populations elsewhere. The physical bones of the ancestors completely exposed the claim that they were crowded into sedentary farming towns. Beyond macro-level pathology, modern bioarchaeology utilizes advanced biochemical techniques to reconstruct the exact dietary profiles of ancient populations. Chief among these are dental microwear analysis and stable isotope biochemistry. Dental microwear analysis utilizes scanning electron microscopy to study the microscopic pits and scratches left on tooth enamel by the chewing of food. Populations dependent on agricultural grains exhibit uniform, polished wear tracks caused by the consumption of fine flour ground on stone querns. In contrast, pre-colonial Aboriginal teeth exhibit a highly complex, heterogeneous pattern of deep pits, irregular scratches, and microfractures. This profile is the classic signature of a diverse, unrefined hunter-gatherer diet containing wild roots covered in abrasive soil minerals. This microwear profile is the classic signature of a diverse, unrefined hunter-gatherer diet containing wild roots covered in abrasive soil minerals, fibrous vegetation, and animal bones. Furthermore, stable isotope analysis of carbon-13 and nitrogen-15 ratios extracted from bone collagen provides a direct, multi-year record of protein intake. Isotopic profiles from pre-colonial remains across Australia consistently display high values of nitrogen-15. This indicates a diet rich in high trophic level wild proteins derived from macropods, fish, birds, and marine mammals. These biochemical realities show that the pre-colonial diet was anchored by wild meat and diverse, non-domesticated vegetation. This delivers a definitive scientific refutation to the claim of a cereal-dependent agrarian economy. To seal the case, we must look to the microbotanical residues extracted from pre-colonial tool surfaces. If broadacre farming of native millets was the primary economic activity of the inland plains. The grinding stones discovered across these regions would yield a clear, uniform profile of starch grains and phytoliths, the microscopic silica structures formed inside plant tissues dominated by domesticated cereal varieties. However, forensic microbotanical studies of prehistoric grinding tools show a highly diverse, opportunistic plant processing profile. The tools reveal a varied mix of residues from wild roots, acacia seeds, fern rhizomes, and local sedges rather than single-crop processing. This mix matches the opportunistic, foraging habits of mobile hunter-gatherers who processed whatever local resources were available as they moved through changing environments. The lack of a single, dominant cereal grain signature across these tools completely refutes the claim of a specialized, broadacre grain economy. It confirms that native grains were just one seasonal option within a broad, flexible foraging strategy. The entire agricultural thesis of dark emu ignores the fundamental, unyielding laws of soil chemistry and geology. The global expansion of agricultural civilizations has occurred almost exclusively in regions blessed with young, nutrient-rich soils landscapes shaped by recent glacial grinding, active volcanic activity, or massive alluvial river systems that regularly deposit fresh, mineral-rich silt. These processes constantly replenish essential soil nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen. The Australian continent, by contrast, is geologically unique. It has enjoyed immense tectonic stability for hundreds of millions of years, escaping the recent glaciations and large-scale volcanic eruptions that rejuvenated the soils of Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Consequently, Australian soils are some of the oldest, most weathered, and most heavily leached on Earth. They are naturally missing crucial macronutrients, particularly phosphorus, which is essential for plant root development and grain production. To run a pre-industrial, broadacre, sedentary agricultural system on these ancient, fragile soils without modern synthetic fertilizers is an ecological impossibility. Had pre-colonial Aboriginal populations attempted to subject the inland plains to regular mechanical clearing and monoculture grain farming, it would have triggered rapid soil exhaustion, devastating wind erosion, and systemic ecological collapse within a few generations. Aboriginal societies understood the geological limitations of their country perfectly. They knew that the only way to sustainably inhabit a nutrient-poor, hyperarid continent was to reject the destructive extraction of agriculture. Instead, they embraced a sophisticated, non-extractive hunter-gatherer paradigm that relied on constant mobility, allowing small footprints of land time to naturally recover and regenerate. Central to Pascoe's claim of an agricultural economy is the supposed creation of massive, multi-seasonal grain surpluses stored in permanent regional silos. In global history, food storage is the economic engine of agriculture, allowing sedentary societies to feed non-producing elites, specialized artisans, and armies during winter months or crop failures. However, the climate of inland Australia is defined by extreme, unpredictable cycles of weather driven by the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, unlike the reliable seasonal cycles of Europe or North America. Australia experiences multi-year droughts followed by sudden, catastrophic flooding. In such a volatile environment, attempting to store large quantities of wild grass seed in simple, permanent ground structures is an invitation to disaster. The high ambient humidity of flood years and the prevalence of specialized native pests such as the grain weevil Cetophilus granarius, various fungal molds, and opportunistic rodents would destroy unsealed grain stores within weeks. The ethnographic and historical records show that while Aboriginal groups did occasionally store small amounts of seed for short-term consumption or upcoming ceremonial gatherings, their primary storage strategy was the landscape itself. They left seeds on the living plant or spread across the country, relying on mobility and deep geographical knowledge to harvest fresh resources across different climate zones rather than hoarding decaying piles of grain in a fixed spot. The water resource management claims advanced within dark emu suffer from a profound lack of hydrological scaling. Pascoe describes regional systems of irrigation, ditches, and broad-scale terracing that imply a predictable, managed hydrological regime. Yet, the primary geographic feature of Australian river systems, particularly the Murray-Darling, is their extreme coefficient of streamflow variation. Unlike rivers like the Nile or the Danube, which feature highly predictable seasonal flood pulses, Australian rivers are characterized by extended periods of complete structural cessation, where channels are reduced to isolated mud pools, punctuated by sudden floods of extreme volume. To build permanent irrigation channels within such a volatile environment is a mechanical impossibility without modern reinforced concrete engineering. A standard seasonal flood in inland Australia would instantly scour out, silting up or entirely obliterating any low-intensity earthwork irrigation channels constructed along the floodplains. Conversely, during the multi-year droughts common to the ENSO cycle, these channels would remain completely dry, rendering any dependent agricultural fields dead zones. The engineering strategies of Aboriginal populations were adapted to this instability. They did not build rigid, permanent irrigation networks designed to force water onto static fields. Instead, they constructed flexible, temporary, seasonal fish traps that operated with the flood pulses, maximizing resource returns during high water events while retaining total operational mobility when the rivers retracted. The mechanical properties of soil across inland Australia create further structural problems for early farming models. The heavy river basins of the interior are dominated by vertisols dense, grey, cracking clays that possess unique structural challenges. During dry phases, these soils contract violently, forming deep vertical fissures and turning as hard as rock. During wet phases, they absorb water slowly, swelling into a sticky, dense mass that restricts oxygen access to plant roots. To farm these soils using pre-industrial hand tools is nearly impossible. Without heavy iron plows drawn by draft animals to break up the rock-hard clay during dry spells, or complex drainage systems to manage the dense mud of wet phases, broadacre crop cultivation cannot function. Aboriginal communities understood these soil limitations perfectly. They did not attempt to till or clear these difficult vertisol plains. Instead, they waited for natural seasonal floods to trigger the growth of wild native grasses, harvesting the bounty without risking the severe erosion and soil damage that mechanical farming would cause. For several years, the mainstream success of dark emu created a deep divide between public belief and scientific reality. This divide was permanently closed in 2021 with the publication of the definitive academic monograph, Farmers or Hunter-Gatherers? The Dark Emu Debate. The work was authored by two of Australia's most respected scholars, Professor Peter Sutton and Dr. Karen Walsh. Professor Sutton is an eminent anthropologist and linguist with over 40 years of direct fieldwork experience in Aboriginal communities. Dr. Karen Walsh is a specialist in Australian archaeology, renowned for her forensic attention to material evidence. Sutton and Walsh conducted a clinical, line-by-line, forensic investigation of Pascoe's book, checking every single reference and explorer quote. They checked every archaeological assertion against the original source materials. Their findings were definitive. They exposed Dark Emu as a text completely compromised by basic errors, selective quoting, a lack of contextual understanding, and an active erasure of genuine Aboriginal history. They demonstrated that Pascoe had repeatedly taken descriptions of complex hunter-gatherer activities and deliberately rebranded them with agricultural terms to mislead the reader. Sutton and Walsh's critique was not a defense of colonial perspectives. It was a powerful defense of empirical truth. It was written to protect the real history of Aboriginal people from being replaced by a modern political myth. A major element of the critique focused on Pascoe's failure to understand the sophisticated social structures of pre-colonial Aboriginal Australia. Dark Emu assumes that a society can only organize large-scale public works if it possesses a centralized political hierarchy. This view completely misses the power of the Aboriginal kinship and ceremonial network. Pre-colonial Australia was organized around highly complex, non-centralized systems of skin groups, clan totems, and dreaming tracks. These kinship systems created powerful networks of mutual obligation, land stewardship, and resource sharing across tribal boundaries. When a massive seasonal resource glut occurred, such as an eel migration at Budgebim, groups did not need a king to mobilize labor. They used their complex kinship networks to invite hundreds of relatives from distant regions to gather and cooperate. Once the resource surge ended, this gathering naturally dispersed back into regional bands. By assuming complex cooperation only occurs within a sedentary town, Dark Emu ignores the brilliant, non-centralized, social organization of Aboriginal culture. One of the most devastating components of the critique comes from the domain of historical linguistics. Language is a direct mirror of a society's material and economic focus. In any culture that transitioned to agriculture, the lexicon expands to include specialized words for farming infrastructure. When linguists reconstruct ancestral Aboriginal languages, they find a total absence of native vocabulary corresponding to agricultural mechanics. There are no pre-colonial words for plowing, sowing seed, domesticating plants, or clearing fields. Instead, these languages possess an unmatched vocabulary for wild plant properties, seasonal variations, and tracking animals. A language system does not fail to develop terminology for its primary economic activity over thousands of years. The total absence of an agrarian lexicon is definitive cognitive proof that the economy was organized around hunter-gatherer mobility. The agricultural model presented in Dark Emu requires fixed territorial lines, where communities own specific fields and guard them against outsiders to protect their labor investments. Pascoe projects this system onto the landscape, describing fixed tribal zones that match the property maps of European farming nations. This view completely misinterprets the dynamic reality of Aboriginal cartography, which was built upon songlines. A songline was not a static border fence drawn on a map. It was an ancestral path. These paths crossed thousands of kilometers of country, connecting sacred geographic points through song, story, and ceremony. These paths acted as shared geographic highways, allowing different language groups to cross vast distances safely during environmental crises. Ownership was defined by spiritual custody of specific story nodes along the path, not by the physical exclusion of neighbors from fields. By turning these fluid, spiritual networks into rigid agricultural property lines, Dark Emu replaces a brilliant system of cross-continental connection with a basic Western property model. The deepest ideological failure of Dark Emu is its unintentional embrace of the very colonial prejudices it claims to fight. For centuries, 19th century social evolutionary theory influenced by colonial thinkers like Herbert Spencer argued that human societies progressed through a rigid, linear hierarchy, from primitive nomadic hunting to advanced pastoralism to civilized sedentary agriculture, and finally to industrial urbanism. This hierarchy was used by colonial powers to justify the theft of indigenous lands, arguing that because hunter-gatherers did not improve the soil through farming, they lacked true ownership of the earth. Rather than tearing down this deeply racist, outdated ladder of progress, Dark Emu climbs right up it. Pascoe completely accepts the premise that a society must be agricultural to be considered sophisticated and worthy of respect by the modern world. Instead of defending the profound dignity, complexity, and success of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, the book assumes that Aboriginal people must be retroactively turned into farmers to prove their civilizational value. This is a subtle and dangerous form of Eurocentric cultural erasure. It tells modern Australians that Indigenous culture is only valuable if it can be shown to have copied European styles of farming, housing, and resource accumulation. In his attempt to find agriculture across the continent, Pascoe completely misinterprets the complex practice of controlled landscape burning. Famus liter met vijstringwijnbijn. Dark Emu presents this as a form of proto-agriculture, an intermediate step toward crop cultivation. This view completely distorts reality. Controlled burning was the ultimate expression of an advanced hunter-gatherer relationship with the environment, using fire with incredible precision. This burning cleared dense undergrowth to prevent catastrophic, uncontrollable summer bushfires. It stimulated the growth of fresh green grass, which acted as a natural magnet to attract large game like kangaroos. It maintained open pathways through the country, ensuring easy mobility for traveling bands across the landscape. It encouraged the growth of diverse wild food plants without altering their genetic profiles or depleting the soil. Firestick farming was designed to optimize the natural ecosystem for wild harvesting, not to replace it with artificial farms. Calling this practice agriculture stretches the definition until it becomes meaningless, hiding the true brilliance of indigenous land management. The underlying philosophy driving dark emu's reception is a manifestation of the naturalistic fallacy crossed with modern eco-romanticism. Pascoe attempts to project 21st century environmental and social aspirations backward onto an ancient past. By constructing a narrative of a peaceful, sedentary, agrarian society that lived in absolute ecological harmony while running an agricultural economy, the text invents a world that runs counter to all cross-cultural anthropological historical data. Everywhere in human history where broadacre agriculture was adopted, it led immediately to landscape simplification, deforestation, soil degradation, and social stratification. Agriculture is, by its very engineering definition, a highly extractive, transformative process. By claiming that pre-colonial Australia ran an agricultural economy while somehow avoiding any of the environmental changes associated with farming, dark emu leaves the domain of history and enters the realm of pastoral fantasy. The genuine, ecological sustainability of pre-colonial Aboriginal culture existed precisely because they avoided the extractive trap of agriculture, choosing instead to remain highly flexible hunter-gatherers within an environment that punished permanent environmental disruption. By focusing exclusively on material benchmarks like buildings, fields, and grain stores, dark emu unintentionally devalues the profound spiritual economy that defined pre-colonial Aboriginal life. In traditional Aboriginal society, the landscape was not a passive collection of raw materials waiting to be turned into commodities. The land was a living, conscious entity filled with the presence of ancestral creation spirits. Human activity was designed to maintain, protect, and sing this sacred landscape into continuous being through ritual action, rather than conquering it for profit. By judging the value of Aboriginal society purely by its material infrastructure, dark emu imposes a basic Western capitalist value system onto a culture that possessed a completely different understanding of human purpose. It measures civilizational success by what was built, rather than by the depth of connection. The rise and fall of the dark emu narrative represents a critical turning point for the discipline of Australian history. It highlights the dangerous consequences that occur when educational institutions value emotional and narrative comfort over hard, empirical evidence. History is not a collection of myths that can be rewritten at will. It is an empirical science anchored to real primary texts and physical remains. When we replace real, evidence-based research with romantic myth-making, we do a profound disservice to the nation. The rejection of dark emu by modern scholarship is not a political step backward. It is a vital act of scientific recovery. It demonstrates that the path to a true understanding of the past relies on a commitment to objective truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. In the final analysis, the deconstruction of dark emu allows us to reclaim the true, unadulterated genius of pre-colonial Aboriginal culture. The real history of this continent is far more fascinating and profound than any artificial agricultural myth. For over 60 millennia, across catastrophic ice ages and periods of extreme drought, Aboriginal Australians maintained a highly successful civilization. They did not achieve this by clearing the forests or packing themselves into permanent, disease-ridden towns. They achieved it through extreme mobility, deep ecological intelligence, and a profound philosophy of environmental stewardship. To look back at this incredible human achievement and claim that it is only valuable if we rebrand it as a farming society is historical disrespect. It silences the authentic voices of the ancestors and replaces them with an artificial, modern caricature designed for political agendas. By returning to a strict, evidence-based history, we give Aboriginal people back their true past and protect their memory. They stand, as they truly were, the ultimate masters of a nomadic way of life, thriving in harmony with the rhythms of a hard and beautiful continent.